Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressives. Just point of order, remember he became president in 1901 when the actual president died and he took over. The president was assassinated, he took over, and the people who nominated him for the vice president wanted him to be vice president because it was pretty much a dead-end job and didn't have a whole lot of power. So they wanted this troublesome guy, Theodore Roosevelt, to be kind of silenced by the vice presidency. But because the president died, he takes over as president. He becomes the most powerful man in the land. And now all these people, his political rivals, have to deal with him on a much grander scale. So Theodore Roosevelt, when he comes into office as president, puts forth what he calls a square deal. So a square deal for every man, big or small, rich or poor. A man who is good enough to shed blood for his country is good enough to be given a square deal. Basically, he just wants fair option, fair attempt at life. He's not saying you should be guaranteed anything in life, but you should, if you work hard, due diligence, you should have a fair shot at getting it as anybody else. So this is where like big corporations, like Carnegie Steel and Rockefeller Oil, have kind of eliminated some of that competition. This is where he is going to use some of the legal powers to step in and try to break those up to restore competition, to return the nation back to that square deal he's promising. And in that context, there are some trusts, which are these big corporations. So you have good trusts that he kind of supports and he kind of restrains, but he finds beneficial for the nation. But then you have those bad trusts, those that have become too big and detrimental and have grown beyond and are impeding competition. And he's going to begin breaking those up using the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed a few years earlier. Another aspect of labor that he's working with deals with is the coal strike of 1902. Now, the coal workers weren't being paid what they thought was fair. You have children laborers, all these kinds of things, and they're all on strike. So Roosevelt's actually going to step in and negotiate between the workers and the mine owners. And one of the big avenues he used to kind of force them to come to the table and make some agreements is he says, people are going to freeze during winter if we don't have this coal. So y'all have a choice. You can either come to an agreement between the workers and the owners, or I can take the US Army, march them into the mines, mine the coal, and give it to the American people. So when both sides were going to lose, they very quickly became able to find a middle ground and become uh, able to negotiate with each other. The Elkins Act in 1903, it allowed the government to impose heavy fines on railroads that offer rebates and upon shippers that accepted these rebates. So if there was discriminatory practices that benefited the bigger companies or people that shipped more often, they could get fined for showing preferential treatment compared to smaller people using the railroad, smaller companies or smaller farmers or different things like that. Another major act is the Roosevelt Corollary of 1904. Now this expands the Monroe Doctrine. So Monroe Doctrine says European nations cannot come and settle or colonize the United States or the Americas anymore. Roosevelt takes it further and says if any European nation wants to interact or negotiate with South American countries, the United States will now serve as an intermediary. Like anybody who wants to deal with the Americas, any of the Americas, North, Central, South, they have to go through the United States. We are basically the gatekeeper in Roosevelt's mind. Election of 1904, Roosevelt is going to win again. So it's Roosevelt and his vice president versus Alton Parker for the Democrats. Now the Democrats win that South again, solid South like we've been talking about. But the North goes almost exclusively to Roosevelt. And it's a pretty big margin in favor of Roosevelt. Americans generally like Roosevelt, even a lot of Southerners like Roosevelt. But the states still went Democrat because the South votes Democrat. Now, there's a lot of problems in the cities and all through society that Roosevelt and other like-minded progressives are going to start fixing. One of the big reasons everything's so gross and disgusting and terrible in many of these cities is there's no regulation. The city swelled rapidly in size because of massive immigration. They weren't ready for this. They didn't have houses, they didn't have infrastructure, they didn't have sewers, anything built up to deal with this. But they hastily put up buildings for houses and all these different kinds of things, and now we're dealing with the consequences. And as the middle class begins discovering many of these problems, so child labor and all these other types of things, they start exposing them. People start writing articles in journals and magazines trying to raise awareness. This is where you get a group of people called the Muckrakers. So this is where people kind of scrape the muck, the veneer off of society and show what's really going on underneath. So Ida Tarbell is one of the biggest, and she is going to write a multi-part expose on Standard Oil. That's Rockefeller's oil company, showing that J.D. Rockefeller had this kind of ruthless business practice that ran people out of business and created a true monopoly. Remember, he controlled 90% of the oil industry. And she exposes how not only did they obtain control of the market shares, they used that wealth to then influence Congress and government to help them keep control. And that's where people were really shocked, is that wealthy people could use their money to influence government. Today we kind of think that as an obvious idea or obvious conclusion, but at the time, this is a shocking revelation for many people. Upton Sinclair wrote a novel called The Jungle. While it's a fictional book, it's about his experiences going undercover in a meat packing plant in Chicago. We'll read one little quick excerpt to see kind of what he was writing about. Now, the purpose of his book was to show labor issues. But what really got people was the disgusting conditions in which their food was being produced. So here's one excerpt from it to show kind of what people were revolted by. He says, "It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would all go into the hoppers again. So they would just grind it all up. If someone injured themselves, like cut a finger off or anything else, that would just go in. If the meat was looking not red enough, they would add arsenic to it. And arsenic will kill you in high enough quantities, but in small quantities, it'll just make you kind of sick, but it returns the red vibrancy back to the meat. So there's a lot of these rather unhealthy tricks and things going on. Now, Ida B. Wells is another muckraker, and she's going to be writing articles trying to expose lynching in the South. So you'll see a lot of what she wrote about going on in the lynching lecture later on. So you have all of this kind of coming together, all these people writing, trying to expose problems in society. And the progressives are going to try a lot of different things to try to help improve society in a number of different ways. Some really do improve things, others kind of go a little too far. So you have the Hepburn Act in 1906. This gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to set maximum railroad rates. So this means they can't overcharge smaller farmers and undercharge big shippers. So it's trying to make a fair playing ground, at least for shipping along the railroads. The Pure Food and Drug Act is one of the biggest laws Roosevelt helped get passed, because he read Upton Sinclair's Jungle as well and was really grossed out by it, and is going to help push this law through to get true regulation of our food industry, so that people have to put labels on the food. So whenever you buy a box of something, it says what's the ingredients are, so you know what's going into it. You have to prove what's going into it. And this is kind of the predecessor to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Now, you have these progressives trying to improve the conditions of the poor, women, children, all of these different groups. Cities and industrialization have produced a lot of these problems, and they wanted an active government to step in. And many of these progressives shared a belief that science and technology had helped cause these problems, and therefore science and technology can help cure these problems. Now, it's mainly The middle class pushing for these reforms. The wealthy are the ones profiting from them. The poor are too busy working to really protest. So it's the middle class that are the ones making the biggest effort at this. And they're really trying to help kind of two major groups, women and children. This is a primary. There's a lot of other stuff going on, but women and children are the two main groups because women don't have the power to vote yet. That's coming soon, but not yet. And then children who are underrepresented by everybody. So another big issue was sexual exploitation. And this dealt with the age of consent, of when a young man or young woman could consent to marriage and sex. Now, in some states, it was as low as 12 years old. So it's unlikely a 12-year-old is going to know what they're consenting to. And today it would be shocking. It's literally criminal in all the states to marry, much less have sex with someone that young. But nonetheless, there are some states where this was extremely low, and the progressive era is when this starts raising up to, 15, 16, 17, eventually 18 is kind of, 16 to 18 is kind of the norm for this. Women are pushing for the right to vote to protect themselves and their children. Not everyone agrees to this. Some men are opposed to it. A lot of women are actually opposed to women's suffrage. They think the man should vote for the family. You have prohibition starting to come onto the scene, the outlawing of alcohol. They think if you get rid of alcohol, you'll eliminate many of the problems of American society. You have the government regulating monopolies, just like Roosevelt did with the trusts. And Roosevelt is going to be kind of the big name for this thing, for this era. He's kind of the most visible paramour of this progressive era. So women begin getting the right to vote at the state level first. And by the time we get to Woodrow Wilson, women will have the right to vote nationally. Prohibition begins taking off state by state. So the progressives are actually, oddly enough, some of the first to pass regulation restricting immigration. So they're progressive in some ways, but they're also restrictive in others. And the age of consent is being raised slowly across many states. Now, one of the places where the progressives went too far is they wanted to perfect human society. They wanted to make the best and happiest people. And they also are going to come up with this idea of eugenics. So this is selective breeding of humans, kind of like you would do with a dog or a horse. And you have governments beginning to say who can and cannot reproduce, and then forcibly sterilizing the people that are found unsatisfactory or undesirable in society. Now this can be anything from a woman who speaks her mind too much, speaks out too much, and is considered hysteric. She could be sterilized. Oftentimes minorities like Native Americans were being sterilized. People that were poor were being sterilized. If you were gay or had some sort of sexual deviance, this is what society called it at the time, that could get you sterilized. So there's a whole slew of issues in this. Now what's worse is this idea of eugenics is going to spread across the states. And the Virginia eugenics program is actually going to serve as the foundation for Adolf Hitler's Nazi eugenics and breeding program. So we actually gift a template of this to the Nazis indirectly. One of the things we fight against later on is this superior race idea, but it's something that the United States accidentally kind of helped create. Now, a quick run through on foreign policy, just to kind of give an idea of what else Roosevelt was doing kind of during this era. So the big thing Roosevelt was pushing for in South America was the Panama Canal. The French had tried to build this, but due to malaria and yellow fever and different diseases in the tropic regions, they couldn't get it built. The United States had the technology to come in, basically wipe out mosquitoes, which transferred the disease, and then get the canal built. Now, we kind of do some shady stuff along the way, but nonetheless, Roosevelt actually goes and visits the canal as it's being built. He actually works one of the big diggers with an all-white suit. I don't know if I would have been brave enough to do that, but nonetheless, he goes and does that. One of the big political things that Roosevelt deals with is the Russo-Japanese War. This is a war where Japan kicks the living crap out of Russia, much to Russia's chagrin. Now, Japan was going to take a whole bunch of territory, but Roosevelt negotiated to basically give the territory back to Russia, prevent further war, and kind of calm everything down. And for this, Roosevelt is actually going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. You have, during this time, something called the Great Rapprochement, where the United States and England kind of put those, long-standing tensions of a post-colonial country and its former colonial master behind them. And we start acting like friends again. And this is none too soon because in the very near future, World War I is going to break out, and the British and the French will need American help. More so, especially during World War II. Then finally, you have the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907. There's a bunch of racial tensions with Japan. There's a big flood of Japanese immigrants coming to particularly California. And in California, they're being segregated into, the Japanese children are being segregated into separate schools. Japan's angry about this. There's a lot of complaints. So Roosevelt makes a deal, kind of a gentleman's agreement with Japan. Basically, he says that we will stop discriminating against children and quit segregating children in California if Japan makes sure to stop sending unskilled labor to the United States. So we want only the skilled and educated from Japan. And this is just another one of those kind of racist immigrant policies. There's a whole slew of them during this time period, before and after as well. But this is just one more. And Roosevelt kind of tries to mitigate the worst aspects of it. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with another lecture next time. Thanks.